What if the most devastating royal decision of this generation wasn't shouted from a balcony, but whispered behind closed doors? No cameras, no dramatic announcement, just a sentence so final, so immovable, that it quietly rewrote the future of 2 children forever. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. My decision is final. Those 4 words didn't just echo through palace corridors. They landed like a gavel. And according to multiple insiders, when the message reached Meghan, the reaction wasn't anger first, it was disbelief. Then silence. Then tears. Because this wasn't a delay. This wasn't a negotiation tactic. This wasn't something that could be fixed with time, pressure, or public sympathy. This was a door closing. Permanently. Here's the question no one is asking out loud. Why would a king risk looking cruel, outdated, even heartless, unless he believed the alternative was far worse? Think about it. Monarchs are trained to soften language, to leave room for maneuver, to let time do the dirty work. And yet, in this moment, King Charles reportedly chose language with no escape hatch. No ambiguity. No future revision. A line drawn not just against Meghan, but against the possibility of Archie and Lilibet ever being named prince and princess. Forever. And that word matters. Because forever means this decision wasn't emotional. Emotional decisions wobble. Forever means calculated. Forever means something was seen, assessed, and deemed too dangerous to leave open-ended. So what changed? Why now? Why take a step so severe that it would almost guarantee backlash, headlines, and public outrage? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because for years, the narrative has been simple: Meghan versus the monarchy. Emotion versus tradition. A personal feud. A family falling apart in public. But what if that framing is wrong? What if this decision had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with containment? Sources close to palace operations have hinted at something chilling. That the real fear inside royal walls was never embarrassment. It was precedent. The kind of precedent that doesn't just affect one generation, but destabilizes the entire structure. Ask yourself this. If titles can be weaponized, monetized, or leveraged from outside the institution, what happens next? And if the palace hesitated once before, what forced their hand this time? This is why Meghan's reported reaction matters. Not because of the tears themselves, but because of what those tears represented. The moment it became clear that influence had limits. That public pressure had hit a wall. That no interview, no statement, no wave of support could reverse what had already been sealed. And just when it seemed like this was simply a tragic, cold-hearted royal decision, a detail emerged. A quiet rule, rarely used, almost never discussed. A rule that explains why this outcome was not only inevitable, but necessary. And once you understand that rule, the story stops being about Meghan entirely. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the door closed forever didn't happen in public. That's the part that unsettles people the most. No dramatic declaration. No press release with careful phrasing. No balcony moment where the world could gasp all at once. Instead, it happened quietly, almost clinically. A decision executed the way institutions handle things they never want reversed. Here's the shocking part. When something is meant to be undone later, the palace leaves language loose. Vague. Elastic. But this time, the wording was tight. Surgical. Every clause locked into place like it was designed to survive decades of scrutiny. So ask yourself this. Why remove flexibility unless flexibility itself had become a threat? This wasn't a pause on titles. It wasn't not now. It wasn't even under review. According to insiders familiar with the structure of royal decisions, this was the kind of action used when the crown wants to ensure something never comes back to the table, no matter who is king next. And that's when the emotional weight hit. Because once the meaning became clear, it wasn't just Meghan who understood the implications. Everyone did. Supporters, critics, even neutral observers. Forever means no coming-of-age reversal. Forever means no future coronation upgrade. Forever means no quiet restoration once headlines fade. And that's when the contradiction surfaces. Publicly, this looks brutal, cold, even vindictive. But privately, this is how the monarchy behaves when it believes uncertainty is more dangerous than outrage. Here's something few people talk about. Royal titles aren't just honorifics. They're legal, symbolic, and reputational assets. They carry weight in diplomacy, media, branding, and global perception. Once they exist, they cannot be easily controlled, especially outside the institution. So what happens if those titles live beyond royal boundaries? What happens if they become tools instead of traditions? That's the question the palace was reportedly asking itself. And suddenly, this decision stops looking like a punishment and starts looking like a firewall. Now imagine being on the receiving end of that realization. Imagine believing the door was still open, only to discover it had been sealed long before the message reached you. Not slammed in anger, sealed in procedure. That's where the emotional collapse reportedly came from. Not shock at cruelty, but shock at finality. Because there's something uniquely devastating about realizing you're no longer part of the equation at all. And yet, here's the part that complicates everything. This decision wasn't triggered by one incident. It wasn't a single interview, a single comment, or a single moment of tension. It was cumulative, a slow build, a series of evaluations, a conclusion reached long before it was announced, which raises an uncomfortable question for everyone watching. If the palace waited this long to act, what finally convinced them they had no other choice? Because institutions don't choose permanence lightly. And they certainly don't do it unless they believe the alternative is irreversible damage. But the real twist? This decision wasn't actually aimed at the present. It was aimed at preventing a future the palace refused to allow. And once you understand what future they feared most, this moment stops being shocking. It becomes chilling. But what came next would reveal exactly why flexibility was taken off the table, and why this was never going to end any other way. We continue. If you think this decision was personal, here's the uncomfortable truth. That assumption is exactly why most people missed what was really happening. Because the palace wasn't reacting. It was anticipating. The biggest misconception surrounding this moment is the belief that King Charles woke up one morning, frustrated or wounded, and decided to draw a hard line. That makes for a dramatic story, but it's not how institutions survive centuries. Institutions move slowly, quietly. And when they finally move, it's because they believe the consequences of doing nothing are far worse than the backlash of acting. So let me ask you something directly. When has the monarchy ever chosen speed over stability? Exactly. This wasn't about emotion. This was about risk management. Inside royal strategy circles, there's a concept rarely discussed publicly: future leverage. It's the idea that today's silence can become tomorrow's vulnerability. And titles, especially ones connected to the line of succession, create leverage that can be activated years, even decades, later. That's where the fear crept in. Because once a title exists, it doesn't just belong to a person. It belongs to narratives, platforms, contracts, alliances, and interpretations far beyond royal control. And the palace has learned, sometimes painfully, that once those forces are in motion, they don't stop on command. Here's the contradiction that makes this decision so hard to swallow. By refusing titles now, the monarchy accepts short-term outrage in exchange for long-term certainty. It's a trade-off few leaders are willing to make, unless they believe the future consequences are existential. And that's the key word: existential. According to those familiar with internal discussions, the concern was never embarrassment. It was erosion. Slow, subtle erosion of authority, of boundaries, of the unspoken rules that hold the entire structure together. Think of it like this. You don't reinforce a dam when the water is calm. You do it when you see pressure building beneath the surface, pressure that looks invisible to outsiders but terrifying to engineers. So where does Meghan fit into this? Painfully, almost incidentally. That's what makes this so devastating. Because when an institution shifts into survival mode, individual feelings stop being central. The system doesn't ask who will cry. It asks what must be prevented. And this is where the emotional weight becomes unbearable. Because the realization isn't they chose against me. The realization is they chose without me. That's the moment when influence disappears. When negotiations end not with an argument, but with silence. And silence, in royal terms, is final. Still, none of this explains why the decision had to be permanent. Not delayed, not conditional, permanent. For that, you have to understand something almost never discussed outside palace walls. There is a silent rule, used only when the crown believes a future scenario could spiral beyond control. It's not written for drama. It's written for containment. And once that rule is invoked, there is no path back, no matter who sits on the throne next. This is the detail that changes everything. The one that turns a painful family story into a cold, institutional maneuver. Because once this rule was activated, the outcome was no longer about mercy or reconciliation. It was about stopping a future the monarchy refused to allow. And when that future finally came into focus, even the harshness of this decision began to make a terrifying kind of sense. But what came next would expose the rule itself, and why invoking it meant there was never any other ending possible. There is a reason this rule is never explained publicly. Because the moment people understand it, they also understand how serious the situation had become. This rule isn't about punishment. It isn't about favor. And it certainly isn't about emotion. It exists for one purpose only: to stop a future scenario from ever materializing. Here's the shocking part. In royal systems, there are decisions designed to be reversible, and decisions designed to be immune to time. This was the second kind. The kind that survives public anger, media cycles, even changes in leadership. Why? Because the palace was no longer thinking about today. It was thinking about 10 years from now. 20. 50. Ask yourself this. What happens when ambiguity is left in place long enough for someone else to weaponize it? History has already answered that question more than once. And each time, the crown paid a price it never wants to pay again. That's why silence mattered more than explanation. Because explaining invites debate. Debate invites pressure. Pressure invites precedent. And precedent is the one thing the monarchy fears losing control of. This silent rule is activated only when one conclusion has already been reached, that flexibility itself is dangerous. That leaving doors open creates leverage for people who no longer operate within the system's boundaries. This is where the emotional irony cuts deepest. Because from the outside, it looks cruel. But from the inside, it looks preventative. Like cutting a wire before a spark becomes a fire. And once this rule is invoked, there is no appeal process. No future king can simply undo it without reopening the very risk it was designed to eliminate. That's what forever actually means. Not spite. Not revenge. Containment. Now imagine the moment that realization lands. Not the moment of announcement, but the moment of comprehension. The moment when it becomes clear that this isn't a phase. That this isn't a strategy. That this isn't something that will soften with time. That's when grief replaces anger. Because anger believes change is still possible. Grief understands finality. This is reportedly where everything shifted. Where the tears weren't about titles anymore, but about understanding that the system had closed ranks in a way that could not be penetrated. And here's the contradiction that makes this story so unsettling. The more public pressure mounted, the more certain the palace became it had made the correct choice. Why? Because institutions read escalation as confirmation of risk. The louder the noise became, the clearer the signal looked from inside. That's the paradox most people miss. And yet, even now, many still believe this was a family feud gone wrong. That if emotions cooled, if apologies were made, if time passed, something might change. But the rule doesn't care about reconciliation. It only cares about preventing a future that once glimpsed cannot be unseen. So the real question isn't whether this decision was harsh. The real question is this: what exactly did the palace believe it was stopping? Because whatever that answer is, it was powerful enough to outweigh compassion, public image, and even blood ties. And once that final piece becomes clear, this story takes a turn no one was prepared for. Because the decision didn't just close one door. It quietly locked several others that most people didn't even know existed. And what came next would reveal just how much had already been decided long before anyone heard a word. By the time the public realized what had happened, the most important parts were already over. That's the illusion people still struggle with. The belief that the story climaxed when the decision became known. In reality, that moment was only the echo. The real turning point happened much earlier, when the palace stopped asking how this would look and started asking how this would age. Because institutions don't think in news cycles. They think in decades. And that's where the emotional weight of this decision truly lands. Not in the loss of titles. Not in the headlines. but in the understanding that this choice was designed to outlive everyone involved. Here's the unsettling truth. Once the silent rule was invoked, the matter stopped being a family issue entirely. It became structural, mechanical, immune to sentiment. And that's why no amount of public reaction, positive or negative, could move it. That realization reframes everything. It explains the calm from the palace, the lack of counterstatements, the refusal to soften language. Silence wasn't avoidance. Silence was confirmation. And when you look at it that way, the phrase "my decision is final" stops sounding harsh and starts sounding procedural, like a pilot announcing there's no turning back because the fuel has already been burned. This is where the tragedy sharpens. Because for Meghan, the loss wasn't just symbolic. It was the moment she understood that the institution she once tried to challenge had decided it no longer needed to respond at all. That it had moved past the phase of reaction and into the phase of prevention. That hurts in a way anger never could. And for the children at the center of this, the reality is colder still. Their futures weren't debated in public forums or weighed against popularity. They were decided quietly, based on risk models and institutional memory rather than emotion. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. This wasn't about deserving or not deserving. It was about control. And the irony is brutal. The more this decision is discussed, the more it proves the very concern that led to it. Because attention amplifies uncertainty. And uncertainty is what the monarchy is built to eliminate. So where does that leave things now? It leaves a line drawn so firmly that stepping back over it would require the palace to admit it misjudged the future. And institutions like this do not survive by admitting misjudgment lightly. That's why this moment will be remembered not as a scandal, but as a signal. A signal that the era of flexibility is over. A signal that some doors, once closed, are sealed for generations. A signal that the monarchy has chosen certainty over reconciliation. And yet, one question lingers. If the palace went this far to prevent a future scenario, what does that say about what they believe is still coming? Because institutions don't fortify themselves unless they expect pressure ahead. And if this decision was the shield, what, exactly, is the storm they're preparing for?